Vincent Willem van Gogh was a post-impressionist painter from the Netherlands who is now widely regarded as one of the most significant figures in Western art history. Despite struggling with poverty and depression, he created over 2,100 artworks in just 10 years, including around 860 oil paintings. His paintings encompassed a variety of genres, including landscapes, still lifes, portraits, and self-portraits, all characterized by bold colors and dramatic, expressive brushwork. Born into an upper-middle-class family, Van Gogh was a serious and thoughtful child who enjoyed drawing. He worked as an art dealer in his early 20s but became depressed when he was transferred to London. After spending time as a Protestant missionary in southern Belgium, he took up painting in 1881, with financial support from his brother Theo. He moved to Paris in 1886 and began to develop a unique style that incorporated bright colors and local landscapes. He reached the pinnacle of his artistic expression during his stay in Arles in the south of France in 1888, where he created a series of iconic paintings that included olive trees, wheat fields, and sunflowers. Unfortunately, Van Gogh's mental health deteriorated rapidly, and he suffered from psychotic episodes and delusions. His friendship with Paul Gauguin ended in a violent confrontation where Van Gogh cut off part of his own ear. He spent time in psychiatric hospitals and under the care of a homeopathic doctor, but his depression persisted. In 1890, he died by suicide, shooting himself in the chest with a revolver. Despite being commercially unsuccessful in his lifetime and considered a failure and madman, Van Gogh's reputation grew after his death. He is now celebrated as a misunderstood genius whose artistic legacy has had a profound influence on modern art. His paintings are among the most expensive to have ever sold, and the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam holds the world's largest collection of his works. The most significant source of information about Van Gogh's life and thoughts are the hundreds of letters he exchanged with his brother Theo, who provided him with financial and emotional support throughout his career. Vincent and Theo maintained a correspondence, with Theo keeping all of Vincent's letters, while Vincent only kept a few of the letters he received. After their deaths, Jo Bonger van Gogh, Theo's widow, arranged for the publication of some of their letters. The majority of these letters, which are described as having a diary-like intimacy and providing insight into Vincent's artistic achievements, were published in 1914. The letters include over 600 from Vincent to Theo and around 40 from Theo to Vincent, as well as letters to other artists and critics, some of which are illustrated with sketches. While some of the letters are undated, art historians have been able to place most of them in chronological order. Vincent's letters often mention Jules Breton, a highly paid contemporary artist. In 1875, Vincent discusses seeing Breton's paintings at a salon and sending one of Breton's books on the condition that it be returned. In a March 1884 letter to Anthony van Rappard, Vincent mentions one of Breton's poems that had inspired one of his own paintings. In 1885, he describes Breton's famous work The Song of the Lark as fine. Vincent attempted to meet with Breton in 1880, traveling on foot for 80 kilometers to the village of Corrières, but turned around and returned without making his presence known, possibly due to Breton's success and the high wall around his estate. There are no known letters between the two artists, and Van Gogh is not mentioned in Breton's 1891 autobiography. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30, 1853, in Groot-Zundert, a predominantly Catholic province in the Netherlands. He was the oldest surviving child of Theodorus van Gogh, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus. Vincent was named after his grandfather and a stillborn brother who shared the same name. The name Vincent was common in the Van Gogh family, as it had been borne by his grandfather, a prominent art dealer, and a theology graduate. Vincent's mother came from a prosperous family in The Hague, while his father was the youngest son of a minister. The couple met when Anna's sister married Theodorus's older brother Vincent. They married in May 1851 and moved to Zundert, where Vincent's brother Theo was born in 1857. Vincent also had another brother, Cor, and three sisters, Elizabeth, Anna, and Wilhelmina, whom he remained in touch with later in life. Vincent's mother was a religious and strict woman who placed great emphasis on family and their high social position. Theodorus's salary as a minister was modest, but the church provided them with a house, staff, and transportation. Vincent was a serious and thoughtful child who was educated at home by his mother and a governess before attending village school in 1860. He was then sent to boarding school in Zevenbergen in 1864, but he felt abandoned and campaigned to come home. His parents sent him to the middle school in Tilburg in 1866, but he remained unhappy. Despite his early interest in art, Vincent's education focused on rejecting technique in favor of capturing the impressions of nature or common objects. In March 1868, Vincent abruptly returned home, and he later described his youth as austere and cold, and sterile. In July of 1869, Van Gogh's uncle, Sant, was able to secure him a position at the art dealership Goupil and Cie in The Hague. He completed his training in 1873 and was then transferred to the company's London branch on Southampton Street. He took up residence at 87 Hackford Road in Stockwell and was content with his success at work, earning more than his father at the young age of 20. During this time, Van Gogh developed an infatuation with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Lawyer, but she rejected him as she was engaged to someone else. He grew increasingly isolated and became more religiously fervent. His family arranged for him to be transferred to Paris in 1875, but he was unhappy with the commercialization of art and was ultimately dismissed. Van Gogh returned to England in April of 1876 to work as a supply teacher at a boarding school in Ramsgate. When the proprietor moved to Isleworth in Middlesex, Van Gogh went with him but left to become an assistant to a Methodist minister. He then took a job at a bookshop in Dordrecht, but he found the position unsatisfactory and spent his time doodling and translating biblical passages. He was deeply involved in Christianity, becoming increasingly pious and monastic. In 1877, his family sent him to live with his uncle Johannes Stricker, a respected theologian in Amsterdam. Van Gogh prepared for the University of Amsterdam theology entrance examination, but he failed the exam and left his uncle's house in July 1878. He also failed a 3-month course at a Protestant missionary school near Brussels. In January of 1879, he began working as a missionary in the coal mining district of Borinage in Belgium. He gave up his comfortable lodgings at a bakery to live in a small hut, where he slept on straw to show solidarity with his impoverished congregation. However, his austere living conditions did not please church authorities, who dismissed him for undermining the dignity of the priesthood. He briefly returned to Cusmes before giving in to pressure from his parents to return home to Etten. He remained there until around March of 1880, causing concern and frustration for his parents, particularly his father, who suggested that Van Gogh be committed to a lunatic asylum in Giel. In August of 1880, Van Gogh returned to Cusmes and stayed with a miner until October. He became fascinated by the people and scenery in the area and began to capture them in his drawings, encouraged by Theo to take up art seriously. Later that year, he traveled to Brussels to study under Dutch artist Willem Roelofs, as per Theo's suggestion. Despite his reluctance to attend formal schools of art, Roelofs convinced him to register at the Académie Royale des Beaux-Arts in November 1880, where he learned about anatomy, modeling, and perspective. In April 1881, Van Gogh went to Etten to stay with his parents for a while. He continued to draw, often using his neighbors as subjects. In August of the same year, his cousin Cornelia Kivas Stricker, who had recently been widowed and had an 8-year-old son, came to visit. Van Gogh was thrilled and spent a lot of time with her, but shocked everyone when he declared his love for her and proposed marriage. She rejected him, and he went to The Hague to try and sell his paintings and meet his second cousin, Anton Mauve. Mauve was a successful artist whom Van Gogh admired, and he invited him to return in a few months and suggested he work with charcoal and pastels in the meantime. In late November 1881, Van Gogh wrote an angry letter to Johannes Stricker, which he described to Theo as an attack. He left for Amsterdam soon after, but Key refused to meet him, and her parents were appalled by his persistence. In despair, he held his left hand in the flame of a lamp and said he wanted to see Key for as long as he could withstand the pain. He did not remember what happened after that, but he assumed his uncle had blown out the flame. Key's father made it clear that they would not marry because Van Gogh could not support himself. Mauve took Van Gogh on as a student and introduced him to watercolor, which he worked on for a month before returning home for Christmas. He had a disagreement with his father and left for The Hague, where Mauve lent him money to set up a studio and taught him how to paint in oils. However, they had a falling out, possibly over Van Gogh's use of street people as models, which Mauve did not approve of. In June, Van Gogh contracted gonorrhea and spent 3 weeks in the hospital. He started painting in oil soon after, borrowing money from Theo. He enjoyed the medium and was surprised by the good results he achieved, using liberal amounts of paint and working back with the brush. In March 1882, Mauve ceased communicating with Van Gogh after learning of his involvement with Claesina Maria Seenhoornik, an alcoholic prostitute, and her children. Despite Seen's difficult past, Van Gogh initially defied pressure from his father to abandon her and the children, considering moving them out of the city. However, poverty and the challenges of family life may have strained their relationship, and Van Gogh eventually left Seen and the children in late 1883. Seen's life tragically ended in 1904 when she drowned in the river Scheldt. In September 1883, Van Gogh moved to Drenthe before later residing with his parents in Nuenen, North Brabant, where he focused on his art. He produced sketches and paintings of weavers and cottages, including the parsonage garden at Nuenen. In August 1884, Van Gogh was joined on his artistic ventures by Margot Benjamin, a neighbor's daughter. They fell in love and desired to marry, but their families opposed the idea. After Margot took an overdose of strychnine, Van Gogh rushed her to a hospital, and she survived. Unfortunately, on March 26, 1885, Van Gogh's father passed away from a heart attack. In 1885, during his 2-year stay in Nuenen, Van Gogh painted multiple still lifes and completed numerous drawings and watercolors, as well as nearly 200 oil paintings. His palette at the time mainly consisted of dark earth tones and lacked the vivid colors present in his later work. Early in 1885, a Parisian dealer showed interest in Van Gogh's paintings, prompting Theo to ask if he had any ready to exhibit. In May, Van Gogh presented his first major work, The Potato Eaters, and a series of peasant character studies, which had been several years in the making. However, when he expressed dissatisfaction with Theo's efforts to sell his paintings in Paris, his brother responded that they were too dark and did not align with the bright style of Impressionism. In August, his work was publicly exhibited for the first time in the shop windows of the dealer Lurs in The Hague. However, a scandal ensued when one of his young peasant sitters became pregnant in September 1885, leading to accusations against Van Gogh of forcing himself upon her and a ban by the village priest on parishioners modeling for him. In November of that year, Van Gogh moved to Antwerp and rented a room above a paint dealer's shop. He lived in poverty and ate poorly, preferring to spend the money Theo sent on painting materials and models, with bread, coffee, and tobacco comprising his staple diet. His teeth became loose and painful, and he was hospitalized between February and March 1886, possibly for syphilis, due to his excessive drinking. During his time in Antwerp, he studied color theory and visited museums, particularly studying the works of Peter Paul Rubens, which helped broaden his palette to include colors such as carmine, cobalt blue, and emerald green. He also purchased Japanese ukiyo-e woodcuts, incorporating elements of their style into some of his paintings. Despite his disdain for academic teaching, Van Gogh took the higher-level admission exams at the Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp in January 1886, where he enrolled in painting and drawing. However, due to overwork, a poor diet, and excessive smoking, he became ill and run down, leading to clashes with Charles Verlat, the Academy's director and teacher of a painting class, and Franz Vinck, the instructor of the drawing class. After several conflicts, Van Gogh started attending drawing classes given by Eugene Sibard, but the two came into conflict when Van Gogh refused to comply with Sibard's requirement that drawings express the contour and focus on the line. This culminated in Sibard correcting Van Gogh's drawing of the Venus de Milo so vigorously that he tore the paper, leading to a violent outburst from Van Gogh. He shouted at Sibard, declaring that a woman must have hips, buttocks, a pelvis in which she can carry a baby. According to some accounts, this was the last time Van Gogh attended classes at the Academy, and he left for Paris shortly after. In March 1886, the Academy's teachers decided that 17 students, including Van Gogh, had to repeat a year, but the story that Van Gogh was expelled from the Academy by Sibard is unfounded. In March 1886, Van Gogh relocated to Paris, where he resided in his brother Theo's apartment in Montmartre on Rue Laval and attended Fernand Cormon's studio. In June, the brothers moved to a larger flat on 54 Rue Lepic in Paris, and Vincent painted portraits of his acquaintances, still life paintings, views of Le Moulin de la Galette, scenes in Montmartre, Asnières, and along the Seine. In Antwerp in 1885, he developed an interest in Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints and adorned the walls of his studio with them. He continued collecting them in Paris and tried his hand at japonisserie by enlarging a painting from a figure he traced from the cover of the Paris Illustré magazine. After viewing Adolphe Monticelli's portrait at the Galerie Delary Barrette, Van Gogh adopted a brighter palette and a bolder attack in paintings like his seascape at St. Mary's in 1888. 2 years later, Vincent and Theo published a book on Monticelli's paintings, and Vincent added some of Monticelli's works to his collection. Theo introduced Van Gogh to Fernand Cormon's atelier, where he worked in April and May 1886, and met fellow students Émile Bernard, Louis Ainquidin, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. They all met at Julien Pierre Tanguy's paint shop, which displayed Paul Cézanne's paintings exclusively at that time. 2 large exhibitions were staged in 1886, showcasing pointillism and neo-impressionism for the first time, and bringing attention to Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. While Theo kept a stock of impressionist paintings in his gallery on Boulevard Montmartre, Van Gogh was slow to acknowledge the new developments in art, causing conflicts between the brothers. By early 1887, the brothers had reconciled, and Vincent had moved to Asnières, a northwestern suburb of Paris, where he met Signac and adopted elements of pointillism. While in Asnières, Van Gogh painted parks, restaurants, and the Seine, including bridges across the Seine at Asnières. In November 1887, Vincent and Theo befriended Paul Gauguin, and towards the end of the year, Vincent arranged an exhibition alongside Bernard, Ainquidin, and possibly Toulouse-Lautrec at the Grand Bouillon Restaurant du Chalet, 43, Avenue de Clichy Montmartre. This exhibition was described as ahead of anything else in Paris, and discussions on art and artists continued and expanded to include visitors like Camille Pissarro and his son Lucien, Signac, and Seurat. In February 1888, Van Gogh left Paris, feeling worn out, and painted over 200 paintings during his 2-year stay. He made his first and only visit to Seurat's studio hours before departing, accompanied by Theo. Ill from drinking and suffering from smoker's cough, Van Gogh sought refuge in Als in February 1888, with thoughts of founding an art colony. The Danish artist Christian Murier Petersen became his companion for 2 months, and at first, Als seemed exotic to him. He described it as a foreign country, with zouaves, brothels, an adorable little Arlesienne going to her first communion, a priest in his surplice who looked like a dangerous rhinoceros, and people drinking absinthe, all seeming like creatures from another world. During his time in Arles, Van Gogh experienced a surge of creativity, producing over 200 paintings and 100 drawings and watercolors. He found inspiration in the local countryside and light, resulting in works rich in yellow, ultramarine, and mauve. These pieces captured rural landmarks such as wheat fields, harvests, and the old mill. 1888, one of 7 canvases sent to Ponthaven as part of an exchange with other artists. Van Gogh's Dutch upbringing influenced his portrayals of Arles, resulting in flat depictions of fields and avenues lacking perspective, but excelling in the use of color. He used a grid perspective frame to paint landscapes in March 1888, and 3 of the works were shown at the annual exhibition of the Société d'Artistes Indépendants. In May 1888, Van Gogh leased the eastern wing of the Yellow House at 2 Place Lamartine for 15 francs per month. Although the rooms were unfurnished and uninhabited for months, he used it as a studio and began a series of paintings, including the Night Café, 1888, Van Gogh's Chair, 1888, Bedroom in Arles, 1888, Café Terrace at Night, September 1888, Starry Night over the Rhone, 1888. And Still Life, Vase with 12 Sunflowers, 1888. In June, he visited St. Mary's de la Mer and taught painting lessons to a Zouave second lieutenant, Paul Eugene Milliot. He also painted boats on the sea and the village. In July, he met Belgian painter Eugene Bach through his friend Dodge McKnight, and the two exchanged visits. Van Gogh hoped for a friendship with Gauguin and the realization of his idea for an artists' collective when Gauguin agreed to visit Arles in 1888. In preparation for his arrival, Van Gogh painted 4 versions of sunflowers in 1 week and bought 2 beds on advice from the postal supervisor. When Gauguin arrived in October, they painted together and completed joint works, including Les Halles Camps. However, their relationship soon deteriorated due to Gauguin's arrogance and domineering nature, and their situation became one of excessive tension. The circumstances surrounding the mutilation of Vincent van Gogh's ear remain unclear. Gauguin claimed that the incident occurred after a series of threatening encounters, possibly related to financial matters. It's likely that Vincent realized Gauguin planned to leave, and heavy rain kept the 2 men confined to the Yellow House. According to Gauguin, Vincent followed him with a razor, but Gauguin's account is unverified as he was most likely away from the Yellow House that night. On the evening of December 23, 1888, after an altercation, Vincent returned to his room and heard voices before partially or wholly severing his left ear with a razor. He then wrapped the ear in paper and delivered it to a woman at a local brothel. The next morning, Vincent was found unconscious and taken to a hospital where his wound was treated, but his ear could not be reattached. The woman who received Vincent's ear was later identified as Gabrielle, a 17-year-old cleaning girl at the brothel. Vincent had no memory of the incident, indicating a possible mental breakdown. He was diagnosed with acute mania with generalized delirium and placed in hospital care. Gauguin notified Vincent's brother Theo, who arrived to comfort Vincent but later returned to Paris. Vincent repeatedly asked for Gauguin, but Gauguin had already left for Paris and would never see Vincent again. They corresponded, and Gauguin even proposed forming a studio together in Antwerp. Visitors to Vincent's hospital room included Marie Ginu and Roulin. Despite being diagnosed with a pessimistic prognosis, Van Gogh recovered and returned to the Yellow House on January 7, 1889. However, he spent the following month in and out of the hospital and his home due to hallucinations and delusions of poisoning. In March, his house was closed by the police after a petition by 30 townspeople, including the Ginu family, who referred to him as the red-headed madman. Van Gogh returned to the hospital, and Paul Signac visited him twice in March. In April, Van Gogh moved into rooms owned by Dr. Ray after floods damaged his paintings. 2 months later, he voluntarily entered an asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Van Gogh gifted his portrait of Dr. Felix Ray, painted in 1889, to Dr. Ray, who did not appreciate it and used it to repair a chicken coop. The portrait is currently housed at the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts and estimated to be worth over $50 million. On May 8, 1889, Van Gogh entered the St. Paul de Mausolée Asylum accompanied by his caregiver, Frédéric Salles, a Protestant clergyman. The clinic was run by a former naval doctor, Théophile Péron, and located less than 30 kilometers away from Arles. Van Gogh had 2 cells with barred windows, one of which he used as a studio. The clinic and its garden became the primary subjects of his paintings during this period. He made several studies of the hospital's interiors and gardens, some of which are characterized by swirls, such as the Starry Night. Limited access to life outside the clinic resulted in a shortage of subject matter. Therefore, Van Gogh worked on interpretations of other artists' paintings and variations of his earlier work. He was an admirer of realism and compared his copies to a musician's interpretation of Beethoven. Between February and April 1890, Van Gogh suffered a severe relapse but was still able to paint and draw a little during this time. Van Gogh's late paintings demonstrate an artist at the height of his abilities, according to the art critic Robert Hughes, longing for concision and grace. After the birth of his nephew, he started working on a picture of branches of white almond blossom against a blue sky to hang in their bedroom. In January 1890, Albert Aurier hailed Van Gogh as a genius in the Mercure de France. Subsequently, Van Gogh painted 5 versions of l'Arlésienne, Madame Ginou, in February, using a charcoal sketch of Gauguin. He was also invited to participate in the annual exhibition of Les XX, an avant-garde painters' society in Brussels. However, at the opening dinner, a member insulted Van Gogh's work, leading to a demand for satisfaction from Toulouse-Lautrec and Signac's declaration to fight for Van Gogh's honor. The insulted member later apologized and left the group. From March 20 to April 27, 1890, Van Gogh participated in the 6th exhibition of the Société d'Artistes Indépendants in Paris, where Claude Monet hailed his work as the best in the show. In May of that year, Van Gogh left the clinic in Saint-Rémy to move closer to Dr. Paul Gachet and his brother Theo in Auvers-sur-Oise. Gachet was an amateur painter who had treated other artists like Camille Pissarro, recommended by whom Van Gogh sought his services. However, upon meeting Gachet, Van Gogh found him as sick as he was. Auvers-sur-Oise was a famous artist hub, with Charles Daubeny moving there in 1861, followed by other artists like Camille Corot and Honore Daumier. Van Gogh completed 2 paintings of Daubeny's garden in July 1890, one of which is likely his last work. During his last weeks, Van Gogh reminisced about his time in the north, inspiring several of the approximately 70 oils he painted in Auvers-sur-Oise. In June 1890, he painted several melancholic portraits of Dr. Gachet, including his only etching, and some other likely unfinished works, such as thatched cottages by a hill. In July, Van Gogh wrote about his fascination with the vast fields of wheat against the hills, describing them as boundless and delicate yellow. He had first become enamored with the fields in May when the wheat was still young and green, and in July, he described them to his brother Theo as being under turbulent skies. To him, these fields represented his profound sadness and extreme loneliness, and he believed that his canvases could express what he could not put into words, the healing and invigorating qualities of the countryside. One of his last oil works, Wheatfield with Crows, completed in July 1890, was associated with melancholy and extreme loneliness by Hulsker, who identified 7 other oil paintings from Auvers that followed its completion. Recent research conducted in 2020 by senior researchers at the Louis van Tilburg and Theo Middendorp Museum, who reviewed the findings of Wouter van der Veen, the scientific director of the Institute Van Gogh, concluded that the exact location of Van Gogh's final work, Tree Roots, was likely some 150 meters away from the Auberge Inn where he was staying. This location was a stand of trees with a tangle of gnarled roots on a hillside, which was depicted in a postcard from 1900 to 1910. Van der Veen believes that Van Gogh may have been working on the painting just hours before his death. On July 27, 1890, Van Gogh, aged 37, is believed to have shot himself in the chest with a 7mm Lefaucheur pinfire revolver. There were no witnesses, and he died 30 hours later. The shooting may have taken place in the wheat field where he had been painting or in a local barn. The bullet was deflected by a rib and passed through his chest without apparent damage to his internal organs, probably stopped by his spine. He was able to walk back to the Auberge where he was attended to by 2 doctors, but without a surgeon present, the bullet could not be removed. The doctors did what they could for him and left him alone in his room, smoking his pipe. The next day, Theo rushed to his brother's side, finding him in good spirits. However, Vincent's health quickly deteriorated due to an untreated infection resulting from the wound, and he died in the early hours of July 29. According to Theo, Vincent's last words were, "The sadness will last forever." On July 30, Van Gogh was laid to rest in the municipal cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise. The funeral was attended by 20 mourners, including family members, friends, and locals such as Theo Van Gogh, Andries Bonger, Charles Laval, Lucien Pissarro, Émile Bernard, Julien Tanguy, and Paul Gachet. Theo, who had been ill, further declined after Vincent's death and passed away on January 25, 1891 in Den Dolder. He was buried in Utrecht. In 1914, Johanna van Gogh Bonger had Theo's body exhumed and reburied alongside Vincent's at Auvers-sur-Oise, where they now rest together. The nature of Van Gogh's illness and its impact on his work have been a subject of much debate, with many retrospective diagnoses suggested. The consensus is that he had an episodic condition with periods of normal functioning. In 1947, Perry was the first to suggest bipolar disorder, a diagnosis supported by psychiatrists Hemphill and Bloomer. However, biochemist Wilfred Arnold countered that the symptoms are more consistent with acute intermittent porphyria, noting that the popular link between bipolar disorder and creativity might be spurious. Temporal lobe epilepsy with bouts of depression has also been suggested. Whatever the diagnosis, malnutrition, overwork, insomnia, and alcohol likely worsened his condition. In 1965, the gun that Van Gogh was said to have used to end his life was rediscovered and was auctioned on June 19, 2019, selling for €162,500, £144,000, $182,000, almost 3 times more than expected. Van Gogh's early attempts at art were unremarkable. As a schoolboy, he drew and painted with watercolors, but few examples survive, and some have been disputed. As an adult, he started at an elementary level, and his uncle Cornelis Marinus, who owned a well-known gallery of contemporary art in Amsterdam, requested drawings of the Hague in early 1882. However, Van Gogh's work did not meet expectations. Marinus offered a second commission with specific subject matter but was again disappointed. Despite the criticism, Van Gogh persisted, experimenting with lighting and different drawing materials. For over a year, he focused on single figures, which were initially criticized but later recognized as early masterpieces. In August of 1882, Vincent van Gogh received money from his brother Theo to purchase materials for plein-air painting. With new vigor, Van Gogh began working on multi-figure compositions, which he later had photographed. However, when his brother criticized their lack of liveliness and freshness, Van Gogh destroyed them and turned to oil painting. Seeking technical advice, he turned to Hague School artists such as Wijsenbruch, Blommers, de Bach, and van der Wiel. Van Gogh moved to Nieuwenan and began working on large paintings, most of which he destroyed, except for the Potato Eaters and its companion pieces. During a visit to the Rijksmuseum, Van Gogh admired the quick and economical brushwork of Dutch masters like Rembrandt and Frans Hals. Aware of his technical shortcomings, he traveled to Antwerp and Paris in November 1885 to develop his skills. In Paris, Van Gogh tried to master a new, lighter palette and was successful in his portrait of Père Tanguy, 1887, which reflects his evolving personal style. Van Gogh was fascinated with Charles Blanc's treatise on color and began to work with complementary colors. He believed that color expressed something beyond its descriptive function and had a psychological and moral weight. Van Gogh frequently used yellow to symbolize emotional truth, sunlight, life, and God. He sought to capture the essence of nature and rural life, often using symbols to convey his message. Van Gogh was critical of overly stylized works and preferred to stay within the guise of reality. He believed that the abstraction of Starry Night had gone too far, and reality had receded too far in the background. Nonetheless, Starry Night is considered a moment of visionary ecstasy. With the stars in a great whirl and the movement in the heaven above reflected by the movement of the cypress on the earth below. The painting is a translation of the painter's vision into a thick, emphatic plasma of paint. From 1885 until his death in 1890, Van Gogh dedicated himself to creating a collection of paintings that embodied his unique vision and could also be commercially successful. He was influenced by Blanc's definition of style, which emphasized the importance of color, perspective, and brush strokes in creating a true painting. Van Gogh used the term purposeful to describe paintings that he believed he had mastered, in contrast to those that were merely studies. Many of his studies were still lives, which he painted in series as color experiments or as gifts for friends. The works he produced in Arles, including The Sower, Night Café, Memory of the Garden in Eton, and Starry Night, made significant contributions to his oeuvre. These paintings, with their broad brush strokes, inventive perspectives, vibrant colors, and distinctive designs, exemplified the style that Van Gogh was striving to achieve. Van Gogh's stylistic developments were often tied to the places he lived in throughout Europe. While he immersed himself in local cultures and lighting conditions, he maintained a highly individual visual outlook. His growth as an artist was gradual, and he was aware of his limitations. He frequently moved to new locations, perhaps to expose himself to fresh visual stimuli and develop his technical abilities. Art historian Melissa McQuillan suggests that these moves also reflected Van Gogh's evolving style and his desire to avoid conflict, providing him with a coping mechanism for dealing with the realities of his current situation. Van Gogh was most passionate about portraiture, describing it as the only thing in painting that moves me deeply and that gives me a sense of the infinite. He aimed to create enduring portraits that captured the emotions and character of his subjects using color rather than photographic realism. Surprisingly, those closest to Van Gogh, such as his brother Theo, Van Rappert, and Bernard, are mostly absent from his portraits. The portraits he created of his mother were based on photographs. One of Van Gogh's most significant series of portraits was of the postmaster of Arles, Joseph Roulin, and his family. Van Gogh painted Augustine Roulin holding a rope that rocked her infant daughter's unseen cradle in 5 different versions of La Berceuse, the lullaby. Van Gogh intended for this painting to be the central image of a triptych, flanked by paintings of sunflowers. From 1885 to 1889, Van Gogh produced over 43 self-portraits, often in series that continued until shortly before his death. These portraits were typically completed during periods of solitude or when he lacked models. They reveal a deep level of self-reflection and were often created to mark important periods in his life. For example, the mid-1887 Paris series was painted when he discovered the works of Monet, Cézanne, and Signac. Van Gogh's self-portraits showcase a variety of physical representations that reveal his mental and physical state. His unkempt appearance, sunken eyes, weak jaw, and missing teeth are often depicted, but he also shows himself with full lips, a long face, and sharp features. He uses vivid colors to highlight the haggard pallor of his skin in portraits painted after December 1888. Some portray him with a beard or bandages, and he shows himself as a painter in only a few. Van Gogh's self-portraits vary stylistically, with some showcasing his interest in the language of color and Japanese ukiyo-e. He also painted several landscapes featuring flowers such as roses, lilacs, irises, and sunflowers. He completed 2 series of dying sunflowers, one in Paris in 1887 with flowers lying on the ground, and the other in Arles a year later, with bouquets in a vase positioned in early morning light. These paintings are built from thick layers of paint that evoke the texture of seed heads, according to the London National Gallery. Van Gogh's interest in technical skill and working methods is evident in 2 series of paintings featuring sunflowers and cypresses. The Sunflower series, completed in 1888, was created during a period of optimism for the artist. He wrote to his brother Theo about his plans to paint a dozen panels of large sunflowers in a symphony of blue and yellow. These paintings were intended to decorate the walls of the Yellow House in anticipation of Gauguin's visit. After Gauguin's departure, Van Gogh included the 2 major versions of the sunflowers in his Les XX exhibit in Brussels. The series is celebrated for its sickly yellow color and expressive brush strokes, contrasting against dark backgrounds. Van Gogh's fascination with cypresses is evident in a series of 15 paintings, in which he brought life to the trees that were traditionally seen as emblematic of death. The series began in Arles with the trees in the distance and continued in Saint-Rémy with them in the foreground. Van Gogh painted several smaller versions of Wheatfield with cypresses at his sister's request, characterized by swirls and densely painted impasto. The Starry Night, one of the notable works on cypresses, features the trees dominating the foreground. Other notable works include Cypresses, 1889, Cypresses with 2 figures, 1889-90, and Road with Cypress and Star, 1890. Between 1888 and 1889, Vincent van Gogh painted at least 15 works featuring olive trees, a subject that he found both demanding and compelling. While in Saint-Rémy, he spent time outside the asylum, painting the gnarled and arthritic trees in the olive groves. These works conveyed a sense of natural life as a manifestation of a continuous field of energy. In a letter to his brother, Van Gogh expressed his satisfaction with olive trees with the Alpills in the background, 1889, writing, "At last I have a landscape with olives." Another early group of works completed by Van Gogh after his arrival in Arles in 1888 was the Flowering Orchards, which consisted of 14 paintings that captured the optimism and joy of spring. These works showcased Van Gogh's version of Impressionism, as well as his emerging personal style. He depicted the blossoming trees with a strong sense of impermanence, and found inspiration in the world of motifs that could not have been more Japanese during their brief blooming period. Van Gogh also painted the landscape and rural landmarks around Arles, including harvests, wheat fields, and the Old Mill, 1888. He often visited farm gardens near Arles and became enthralled by the vegetation and vivid light of the south of France. His use of light in these works conveyed a sense of the sacred, with the trees appearing as a source of light. The Wheatfield series, painted during his time in the asylum at Saint-Rémy, depicted the view from his cells and served as a culmination of his painting excursions. Although many of Van Gogh's late paintings have a somber tone, they are ultimately optimistic and reflect his desire for mental clarity until the end of his life. However, some of his final works reveal his deepening concerns. In July 1890, Van Gogh wrote from Avers about his fascination with the vast wheat fields that stretched out before him, describing them as boundless as the sea, delicate yellow. Van Gogh was particularly captivated by the fields in May when the wheat was young and green. Wheatfields at Avers with White House showcases a subdued palette of yellows and blues, evoking a sense of idyllic harmony. In a letter to Theo on July 10, 1890, Van Gogh described vast fields of wheat under troubled skies. Wheatfield with crows, painted in his final days, reflects the artist's state of mind. Hulsker characterizes the work as doom-filled with threatening skies and ill-omened crows. The painting's dark palette and heavy brush strokes convey a sense of menace. After Van Gogh's exhibitions in the late 1880s, his reputation grew steadily among artists, critics, dealers, and collectors. In 1887, André Antoine exhibited Van Gogh's works alongside those of Georges Seurat and Paul Signac at the Théâtre Libre in Paris. Julien Tanguy acquired some of his paintings. In 1889, Albert Aurier described his work in Le Moderniste Illustré as characterized by fire, intensity, sunshine. 10 paintings were exhibited at the Société d'Artistes Indépendants in Brussels in January 1890, and French President Marie-Françoise Sadi Carnot was reportedly impressed by Van Gogh's work. After his death, memorial exhibitions were held in Brussels, Paris, The Hague, and Antwerp. His work was showcased in several high-profile exhibitions, including 6 works at Les XX, and a retrospective exhibition in Brussels in 1891. In 1892, Octave Mirbeau wrote that Van Gogh's suicide was an infinitely sadder loss for art, even though the populace has not crowded to a magnificent funeral, and poor Vincent van Gogh, whose demise means the extinction of a beautiful flame of genius, has gone to his death as obscure and neglected as he lived. Vincent van Gogh lost his most vocal and well-connected champion, his brother Theo, when he died in January 1891. Theo's young widow, Johanna van Gogh-Bonger, was suddenly tasked with the responsibility of caring for hundreds of paintings, letters, and drawings, as well as her infant son, Vincent Willem van Gogh. Unfortunately, Gauguin, who had previously promoted Van Gogh's work, was not willing to help Johanna with her mission. Even her brother Andries Bonger was lukewarm towards his brother-in-law's art. Another early supporter of Van Gogh, Aurier, died in 1892 at the age of 27 due to typhoid fever. In 1892, Émile Bernard arranged a small exhibition of Van Gogh's paintings in Paris, and Julien Tanguy exhibited some of Van Gogh's works, including several from Johanna's collection. In April 1894, the Durand Ruel Gallery in Paris agreed to exhibit 10 paintings on consignment from Van Gogh's estate. Henri Matisse, who later became an influential Fauvist painter, was inspired by Van Gogh's work when he saw it at the home of John Russell, a close friend of Van Gogh's, while studying art in 1896. Matisse adopted Van Gogh's use of bright colors and abandoned his earth-colored palette. A significant Van Gogh retrospective was held at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris in 1901, which excited André Derain and Maurice de Vlaminck and contributed to the emergence of Fauvism. Van Gogh's work was also featured in several important group exhibitions, such as the Sonderbund Artists Exhibition in Cologne in 1912, the Armory Show in New York in 1913, and the Berlin Exhibition in 1914. Henk Bremer played a vital role in teaching and promoting Van Gogh's art. He introduced Helene Kröller-Müller to Van Gogh's work, and she became an enthusiastic collector of his paintings. Early German expressionist artists like Emil Nolde acknowledged their debt to Van Gogh's work. Bremer also assisted Jacob Bart de la File, who wrote the catalogue Raison à l'œuvre de Vincent van Gogh, which was published in 1928. Van Gogh's fame peaked in Austria and Germany before World War I, helped by the publication of his letters in 3 volumes in 1914. His letters are considered some of the foremost 19th-century writings of their kind, expressive and literate, and contributed to the mythology of Van Gogh as an intense and dedicated painter who suffered for his art and died young. In 1934, Irving Stone wrote a biographical novel titled Lust for Life, based on Van Gogh's letters to Theo, which further popularized his life and work. The novel was later made into a film in 1956, which contributed to his fame, particularly in the United States, where prior to the book, only a few hundred people had heard of Van Gogh. In 1957, Francis Bacon created a series of paintings based on reproductions of Van Gogh's The Painter on the Road to Tarascon, which was destroyed during World War II. Bacon found the image haunting and identified with Van Gogh as an alienated outsider, a position that resonated with him. He shared Van Gogh's theories of art and quoted lines from Van Gogh's letters to Theo: "Real painters do not paint things as they are, they paint them as they themselves feel them to be." Van Gogh's paintings, including Portrait of Dr. Gachet, Portrait of Joseph Roulin, and Irises, are some of the world's most expensive, with some selling for over $100 million. In 1993, the Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired a copy of Wheatfield with Cypresses for $57 million, while in 2015, El Ali de Ali's Camp sold for $66.3 million at Sotheby's, New York, surpassing its reserve of $40 million. In October 2022, two activists protested the effects of the fossil fuel industry on climate change by throwing a can of tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers at the National Gallery in London, but the painting was not damaged due to the protective glass covering. After inheriting the estate from his mother in 1925, Vincent Willem van Gogh arranged for the publication of a complete edition of his uncle's letters and negotiated with the Dutch government to subsidize a foundation to purchase and house the entire collection. The Van Gogh Museum opened in Amsterdam in 1973 and is the second most popular museum in the Netherlands, with more than 1.5 million visitors annually, with 85% of visitors coming from other countries. During the Nazi period, 1933 to 1945, many Van Gogh artworks changed hands, with some looted from Jewish collectors. Some have resurfaced in museums, at auctions, or have been reclaimed by their former owners through lawsuits. The German Lost Art Foundation lists dozens of missing Van Goghs, and the American Alliance of Museums lists 73 Van Goghs on the Nazi-era provenance internet portal.